My name is John Jones, and I am one of the Civic Trust guides. I joined the Civic Trust last year, and I have an interest in Wheatstone partly because I come from an engineering background myself, particularly in the nuclear industry, and I identify with it to some degree. Of course, Wheatstone was born more than 200 years ago, but some of his activities still appear very modern. And he was a remarkable character, largely self-taught, but he became a professor of civil engineering at King's College at a remarkably young age. He was an inventor of a wide variety of gadgets that were extremely useful, but also very much a physicist. But not just that, he was a musician, he composed music himself, he was a poet, an inventor, you have to call him an inventor. But probably more than all of that, he was a mentor of young people. He inspired young people to achieve remarkable things. And I think that's one of the themes of this talk, and probably one of his most important attributes. Wheatstone was born in Barnwood, in the manor house, but his father was a cobbler and had a shop in Westgate Street. There's a plaque where it is. It's not far from the Civic Hall. But he also made musical instruments and sold music. And initially Wheatstone was schooled in the local village school in Barnwood. But when he was a child, his father moved to join his uncle in their business in the Strand in London, and his father prospered and ultimately taught the flute at Kensington Palace to the Princess Royal. So Wheatstone was forced to move to London, which he didn't like for one bit. He ran away and tried to get back to his grandmother in Barnwood, but he was caught and brought back in Stroud, which also figures later in this story. Now, there were some advantages to Wheatstone in having moved to London, because that allowed him access to books which he probably wouldn't have seen if he was here. He was very much interested in using his pocket money to buy second-hand books in London. And one of the books that he picked up for a good price was a treatise by Voltaire on electricity. Now, he bought it and then found, much to his disappointment, that it was in French. But typical of Wheatstone, that didn't really discourage him that much. His next pocket money was spent on buying a French-English dictionary. So he then translated Voltaire from French into English, and the French that he learned was put to good use. Wheatstone later translated French poetry and became a well-regarded translator. Now, he took the Voltaire translations, and he and his brother tried to reproduce the experiments that Voltaire had done. But of course they didn't have a great deal of money. They didn't have enough money to buy the copper plates to make the batteries. Wheatstone, of course, again not that easily deterred, he recognised that he did have a copper penny, and that would do. So that was his battery. When he reached the age of 14, he was apprenticed to his uncle, selling musical instruments in the Strand. Now, Wheatstone was a shy lad. possibly due to having a rough time at school, and he didn't make a great salesman, but he contributed to the business quite significantly because he took an interest in acoustics, and he invented the concertina and the harmonium, and his manufacturing of the concertina soon outstripped the ability that they had within the shop, and it wasn't long before Wheatstone had a factory making concertinas. He didn't just make the instrument, he also came up with a comprehensive set of theory of toothed instruments and how they worked, and that was presented to the Royal Academy. He didn't present it himself because he was a little bit shy. It was actually presented by his lifelong friend, Michael Faraday, who became a physicist of note in his own right. Wheatstone composed music, and he would give it to his uncle, who would publish it, but without telling his uncle that it was his own composition. Obviously, as a young lad, he didn't really have the credibility to sell it in his own name, but it was well regarded and quite noted in its time. Other incidental inventions he had included the stereoscope, which at the time he sold as a curiosity, something which allowed you to better visualize an image. It actually showed quite an insight into how the brain processes vision, but ultimately it became an important tool, not only in medicine but also for photo reconnaissance and other such areas where it's important to be able to get a better visualization of the image than you could if you looked at a flat two-dimensional plate. What else? Another one of his inventions was emission spectroscopy. Wheatstone identified that if you took light from a spark and passed it through a prism, you'd get a series of lines characteristic of the emission frequencies for the spark. And different metals had different lines of colour. You can see some examples there: beryllium, copper, manganese, strontium, titanium. All of them have a different pattern. So if you had an unknown material, you could determine that that one is strontium because it matches up. Now, that was obviously a useful tool for chemists, but it was also used to identify new elements that had never been found before, thallium and one or two others. It's not something that Wheatstone pursued himself. He was happy to present it and let others take it forward, and that was characteristic of a lot of the things that he developed, because life is too short to do everything. Now, one of his inventions, which was quite close to my experience, was the telephone. And I'm not talking about the electrical telephone here, I'm talking about the mechanical telephone, where you have a receiver of sound and a loudspeaker and a rod that connects the two. I actually chipped my tooth as a child making one of these, or rather using one. And they do work. Wheatstone speculated whether you could communicate over long distances using this. But actually I think for practical purposes a few miles is about as far as you could do. What he did use it for was for some musical illusions, where he connected a harp to a piano which was in a different room, and when the piano was played, the harp strings actually vibrated and it appeared as though the harp was playing. one of the trustees of King's College said that Wheatstone was about as close to a magician as anybody you would actually meet. Part of the reason probably why he didn't pursue the mechanical telephone was he came up with a better idea. He was experimenting into transmitting signals over electric cables when a retired army officer, William Fothergill Cook, approached Faraday because he'd come across signals being transmitted in Germany and recognised the commercial importance of it. Faraday sent him to Wheatstone, and Wheatstone showed Cook something that he'd prepared earlier, which was the telegraph. Wheatstone was minded simply to publish, but Fothergill Cook badgered him into patenting it instead. And they did, and for a period they worked well together. The Wheatstone telegraph had a series of dials which pointed to letters, and that's how it spelt out the message. Later he came up with the idea of punch tape, which is what was used in the early computers for storing data.
Yeah, I used to use that.
Yeah, so could I. Yeah. That does show our age, doesn't it?
Just to be able to read it. That's right.
But in the scale of remembering that this is the early 19th century, it is remarkable. He also came up with the Playfair encryption, so that you didn't necessarily send your message in plain text. You could also send it as an encrypted signal. He tried to sell it to the Midland Railway Company, but they didn't see the importance of it. He managed, however, to sell it to the Great Western Railway, and they put in a link between their depot in Stroud and Paddington. Now it happened that a certain John Maxwell, a rogue of a character, poisoned his mistress and was observed to have having done it, and was also observed to getting on the train in Slough for London. Now it takes probably an hour in those days for the train to get from Slough to Paddington. So there was no chance of pursuing him by any other means than sending a telegraph signal. The police sent the telegraph signal. They were waiting for him in Paddington. It's the first time that telecommunications had been used for law enforcement. They caught him, they hung him, and as a result, Wheatstone became a bit of a rock star. The idea of telecommunications became much more widely accepted. It underlined the importance of it. Now, Wheatstone was reasonably well connected at this point, and he collared Palmerston and explained to him the importance of the telegraph. And Palmerston was noted to remark afterwards that he could imagine the day when he'd be asked a question in the House and he'd say, "Just a minute, I'll telegraph the Viceroy and give you an answer." And actually Palmerston wasn't wrong, because the development of the telegraph within the British Empire was a significant part of making it as dominant as it was. And Wheatstone devoted a lot of the latter part of his life to making it happen, and particularly to solving the problems of putting telegraph cables under the oceans. How do you do it? It's not a straightforward thing to do. So once he was so engaged with the telegraph, he wasn't doing an awful lot at King's. But what he did do, and continued to do throughout his life, was to mentor young people particularly. And probably the most important of the people that he mentored was Alexander Graham Bell. Now, Bell had an interest in acoustics because his mother was deaf and he wanted to do what he could for it. And Wheatstone was also interested in that and developed a hearing aid. So Wheatstone showed Bell a lot of what he did, probably the telephone and many of the musical instruments and things like that. And Bell went and studied at King's. King's was a relatively small institution then, so it's likely that that Bell went to Wheatstone's lectures. Almost inevitable that he did. Bell unfortunately had to leave the country when his family emigrated because of the death of his brother with TB. But when he was in Canada, he came up with an idea of improving Wheatstone's telegraph. He thought that it was possible to send more than one signal down the same wire at the same time by multiplexing it in the same way that you do radio signals. So he tried, and fortunately, it failed. A relay got stuck, and the microphone and the loudspeaker at both ends got connected together, and by accident he invented the telephone. He recognised, he could hear what was happening at the other end, and so he pursued this instead of what his investors was telling him, which was the multiplexed version of the Telegraph. They were furious, but they were only furious until he got the patent through, and it was the most valuable patent ever. He became fabulously wealthy and set up Bell Laboratories, which of course gave us the silicon chip, the transistor and all the other things, telephones. As far as telephones were concerned, Gloucester was a bit slow to adopt them. The people said, well, what's the use of it if I can't phone anybody that I know? So they set up a demonstration from the telephone exchange in Berkeley Street to the assembly rooms in Cheltenham. And a certain Mr. Jones used his concertina to play Men of Harlech for the assembled people. And I'd like to think that was a bit of a suggestion that Wheatstone might have had something to do with it. Okay, so that was Bell. We'll talk a bit more about Bell later, but Florence Nightingale is another example. As a young girl, she was a friend of the family of Wheatstone, and Wheatstone didn't like doing the presenting himself. He liked the experiments that he used to speak for themselves, but he got Florence to do the talking for him. And what Wheatstone said was, if I had no other means of a living, I could go about the fairs with her and pick up a good deal of money. He was very positive about Florence, and she in turn decided to make something of her life, that's what they call it. He did try and encourage that, and he got her a place at King's as the first teacher of nursing. As it happened, she never took up that post because the Crimean War intervened, and the War Office used her in a different way, and she became so famous that she was beyond the King's. She got enough money from public prescription to set up Thomas's Hospital and teach nursing there. But her scientific approach to the subject brought us modern medicine, really, as much as anybody else did. Now, not everybody here will be familiar with James Clerk Maxwell. Those that have will probably break out in a cold sweat. Voted the third most influential physicist of all time. Maxwell was unemployed. He'd been sacked from his job lecturing in Scotland and couldn't get another lecturer's job in Scotland. He was a useless lecturer. However, he was also a brilliant mind. Now, Wheatstone, obviously being a useless lecturer himself, valued his mind, and he worked with Wheatstone for about 3 years before he got sacked at King's. And in that time he did some work on the Wheatstone Bridge, but he developed what we now know as Maxwell's equations. Now these are equations that govern much of modern physics, and in particular electromagnetism, but also thermodynamics. Certainly those sets of partial differential equations which give you a headache, I can tell you, give me a headache. But one of the outcomes was that he predicted that the speed of light would not vary, it would be the same in all directions, which goes against Newton's idea, which was that light were waves that travelled in some sort of medium, which he called the ether. Maxwell wasn't so sure that the ether existed. And he suggested Newton was wrong. It happened that Wheatstone had come up with a device for measuring the speed of electricity, because obviously from a practical perspective you needed to know that. It was a device which involved a rotating drum and some interference fringes, all quite complicated, all very clever. He also used it for measuring the speed of light. I didn't do a publication, but his measurement of the speed of light was a bit out. It was no better than Galileo's. But it was improved using his equipment by Folk and Wheatstone, and they got quite a decent value. But more importantly, a certain Michelson-Morley in America took up the challenge, and Wheatstone's friend Alexander Graham Bell financed them to carry out one of the most famous experiments in physics, where they measured specifically the difference in the speed of light in different directions. And they found that there wasn't one. They conclusively demonstrated that whatever speed and direction you pointed light, you measured light, it was always the same. And whatever speed you were travelling, it was still always the same. So, what does that mean? Well, that could only happen if the faster you travel, the slower time is. Which was a bit difficult to get your head around until this man came along, Albert Einstein. And he recognised that there was a certain relativity to this. And when Einstein visited Cambridge, they asked him, well, do you feel that you stand on the shoulders of Newton? And Einstein said, no, I stand on the shoulders of Maxwell. And of course, Maxwell stood on the shoulders of Wheatstone. So, what would the world be like without Wheatstone, I wonder? Without telecommunications? Without the modern health service? Without the telephone? Without the silicon chip? Without Maxwell's equations, electromagnetism, and our understanding of modern thermodynamics? Without relativity? What would life be like without Wheatstone? Well, there is a campaign to try and get Wheatstone's picture on the £50 note. So if you feel that he warrants it, I think he meets all the criteria, then you can sign up for that on the Bank of England's website. I think Wheatstone made a huge contribution, and I think it warrants it. Any questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, John.
Yeah.
First of all, I've got answer the phone. I missed a bit. Was he born in Westgate Street or was he born in Barnwood House?
There is a biography that was published within his lifetime which says that he was born in Barnwood House.
His grandparents lived there.
I don't know whether it was accurate.
No.
It's not clear to what amount of time he spent in Westgate Street and what amount of time he spent in Barnwood, especially given that he went to school in Barnwood, to the village school, which rather suggests that he spent a good fraction of his time at his grandmother's home.
Yeah, but he was christened in St Nicholas Church, which is a parish of the shop.
Yes.
That's the argument to say he was born in.
Yes. So I think what we have to say is we don't know.
Okay. The other question is, you talked about him inventing the concertina, but it was a Wheatstone concertina, which was different, and I can't remember why it's different to the other things that the Italians built.
You must do that now. I think there's an English concertina which
Yes.
flows in and out, and then there's another one that I think you can each note of the scale goes in, out, in, out, in, out. But then there's another concertina that you can press the buttons and pull out, something like that.
Well, the particular about his concertina is that it used a series of vibrating toothed reeds, metal reeds to produce the sound. And it's that type of instrument which is a bit like a Jew's. Yeah, it's that type of instrument that he developed the acoustic theory for. I don't know enough about the Italian concertina.
John, thank you. Question for me, just I moved to Gloucester in 1986 and I learned about Wheatstone, but in my education I never heard of him. I just wonder why the education system doesn't make more of all his achievements, really.
Yes, well, to some extent he started a lot of things, and the key thing that he took through to commercial success was the Telegraph, and I guess he's well known for that. He's also known for the Wheatstone Bridge, which actually isn't something that he really invented. The idea of the voltage balance in that is something that preceded him. The bit of that he invented was the variable resistor, which makes it a practical and useful tool. So I guess you get famous for being commercially successful in something rather than necessarily for coming up with the original idea.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I'll just propose a vote. Thanks to John and round of applause. Thank you.
Yeah.